Right place. We're here to talk about the backfire effect. Yeah, what is that? And who am I? Okay, well, this is me. Yeah. Uh, but what does that mean? All right. So I am a biology professor at Syracuse University. You probably know where that is. It's not too far away from you. You've probably been to our beautiful campus. But I got to tell you, I have not always been a biology professor. You kind of have to do a lot of things to get to that position. But I started off in a place very different from Central New York. Well, different in some ways and not different in other ways. I grew up in a very small town. I was born in a place you probably never heard of, Jonesboro, Arkansas. That's where the Star is, and the Stork is delivering me there. I was born there not because my parents lived there, but because that was the closest place to where they did live that had a hospital. So you can see how far the Star jumps to where I was raised. That's about 60 miles over there to Ash Flat, Arkansas, with a population of 667 people. I have more students than that in the class that I teach right now. So it's kind of like I grew up to be the mayor, only a very different kind of mayor. You can see by the picture there, I did have hair for a little while, and I wanted to be on the ocean. Didn't really have one of those. I was about 350 million years too late. I went to a place called Highland High School. That's how big my high school was. This whole thing right here, that's the entire cafeteria, one window. We're so small that I played football, and I am not a big dude. So my dad went to that high school. He was in the first graduating class of that high school. That's him, proud of me on my first day. And my whole entire community decided that since I was kind of a weird guy, not really that great on the farm, they wanted to send me away to college so that I would come back and be the town doctor. We had one town doctor, and they wanted me to replace him. He was getting old Doc Tucker. So they sent me all the way there. Ooh, Harding University. Pretty conservative place. They sent me there for a reason. They didn't necessarily want my mind to change very much, and they wanted me to come right back home. The thing is, I never actually wanted to be a medical doctor, and I really did want to do other things that no one had ever heard of, because, yeah, I wanted to be on the ocean. We didn't have oceans. We certainly didn't have sea otters. So they were all very, I don't know, they didn't know what to think when I went all the way out to Portland State University in Oregon for a graduate degree studying the foraging ecology of sea otters instead of going to med school. But it turned out all right, and there were other things that I wanted to know about too. So I actually ended up getting another graduate degree, this time in geosciences from Mississippi State University. Go Bulldogs. Yeah, people back in Arkansas weren't very happy about that either. Kind of a rival team there. But, after a while, I decided that, you know what, I really do need to learn more. I needed to help people understand a bunch of things that I knew they weren't getting from what I was doing, teaching biology and geosciences in colleges. So I found the good place for me was McGill University. It's not far away from us right now. I could drive there in maybe 3-4 hours, depending on the traffic and the border, because it is in Canada. It's in Montreal. I went to McGill University and got my PhD there, and soon thereafter, here I am, Syracuse University. I've been here 13 years, with the exception of 1 year I spent on sabbatical as a visiting scholar at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Don't ask me about that. It's pretty cool, but I still don't know much about astrophysics. I tell you, after going through my whole life, we might need a break. Yeah, let's all step outside and have ourselves a nice smoke break. I'm sure you all smoke, right? You carry a pack with you, right? No, probably not, because, well, the students may not be old enough to purchase things, and you all probably know better. You know that smoking is horribly unhealthy, but that was not the message that people were getting not so long ago. Here are some advertisements with the same theme of what you see here. Back when doctors were paid large sums of money by tobacco companies to sell cigarettes to the general public. They even went so far as to insinuate that smoking was healthy. It would keep you from gaining weight. Face the facts. Reach for lucky instead. Oh my gosh. Nurses, dentists, right? The tobacco companies were paying lots of money to doctors and people in medical professions, and even to scientists, sketchily construed, to have a great campaign of misinformation until they had to stop. You can learn more about this in a really great documentary, kind of documentary. It's more like well, I don't know what you call it, like a fact-based fiction kind of movie called Thank You for Smoking. And in that movie, you'll learn all about one of the conservative think tanks, the Heartland Institute, that was at the center of this misinformation campaign and kind of the dubious pseudoscience that they kind of pulled together to keep people hooked on smoking until the evidence became overwhelming, and they kind of convinced the public. And that was a hard thing to do. The Heartland Institute also recently sent out curriculum packets, including a book called Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, and a collection of computer-based curricula and instructions on how to use this. They sent this to science teachers, and you can see their logo right up at the top of the letterhead, explaining why those teachers needed to teach students about why scientists disagree about global warming. Of course, this is not science. It's propaganda. It's part of what's called the climate change denial machine. This concept was kind of documented and put together by a couple of researchers, Dunlap and McCreight, that really talks about how different groups with financial interests, fossil fuels industry, corporate America, conservative foundations, conservative think tanks, all work together with communications companies and work through politicians to keep people in what's known as an echo chamber. People who are predisposed to deny climate change are kept in a bubble and kept from hearing about climate change. And that is a good way to construct an identity around what you think of as yourself and what you believe. And it sets up an interesting thing called the backfire effect. You bring in the politicians. Of course, we all know some of these very famous people, and here's what they have to say about climate change. Our president says that the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Others say that they don't think that it is a problem. They can find counterexamples, those kinds of things. My favorite is James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who brought a snowball into the Senate floor and threw it, claiming that it was snowing outside in Washington, D.C. in the winter, and therefore climate change cannot be a real thing, conflating weather with climate. And perhaps you've seen recently the confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett, in which Kamala Harris basically had her reveal the fact that she does not think that the science is in on climate change and that it is still debatable. Speaking of these conservative think tanks that are part of the climate change denial machine, ACB brought to you by the Heritage Foundation. Very, very similar in many respects to the Heartland Institute. So these conservative think tanks support politicians and media that keep people in that echo chamber. We build an identity, and then it's hard to get around something called the backfire effect. If you want to know more about the backfire effect, there's a really good info comic brought to you by the oatmeal.com that will talk about this well-documented psychological phenomenon. The backfire effect is basically where if you're trying to help people understand something that relates to their core beliefs, not just a regular belief, but a core belief, the belief that the kinds of beliefs that people hold really deeply. It's part of their identity. They're inflexible, they're rigid. And the thing about the backfire effect is if you are dealing with something that is a core belief, it's hard to counter that with data, information, evidence. Because when you bring in something that challenges a core belief, you might actually cause them to hold more staunchly to the beliefs that they already had, holding on to them instead of changing them. The more information you bring in that challenges those core beliefs, the less credible you may seem. Hard to change a core belief. And that's the backfire effect. So can we change people's minds? Yeah, we can, but we have to have research on how to do that. And we have to realize that it's not the same as just providing more evidence. And there's a lot of work that's been done on the backfire effect. And in fact, we know with regard to climate science, there are a few things that actually mostly don't have to do with climate science. Working with one of my grad students who is now a professor at Ithaca College after having spent postdoctoral stints in Georgia and at Duke University. We found among our students that it didn't really matter how much they knew about climate science or really anything else. The only consistent predictor of their attitudes around climate change was their political affiliation. That's not really a good way to inform your science decisions and beliefs. Lewandowski and others found that people who endorse laissez-faire capitalist economics are more likely to reject climate science. People who hold to conspiracy theories, more likely to reject climate science. And people who think that, all those environmental problems have already been solved. Well, there's that. And then there's perceived consensus, what they think that the scientific community thinks about these things. If there is kind of a clear set of evidence that leads the scientific community in one particular way of acceptance. So there's actually lots of different kinds of backfire effects. When we're talking about climate change and other science kind of stuff, two of them are very important. Sometimes we're dealing with the kind of backfire effect that isn't the worldview backfire effect, but much of what we're dealing with climate science is in fact dealing with the worldview backfire effect. So let's look at that. That's when evidence that threatens our worldview can actually strengthen our initially held beliefs. So how do you get around it? Well, one thing that you need to do is affirm the worldview of the person that you're talking to. You actually have to frame your evidence in ways that appeal to their values. Shared shared common values between you and the person that you're talking with can help them to take off the blinders. And when you affirm their identity, then it makes it a little bit easier for them to be receptive to the evidence. So here's a little bit of advice on how to do that. Number one, don't be a jerk. If you come at them with meanness and think, anything that makes them think that you think that they are less of a person or not as smart because they don't believe the things that you do, that's going to set up that backfire effect right away. Avoid things that might trigger the backfire effect. So maybe instead of coming in saying, hey, climate change is real and you need to change your mind, maybe talk about how science works, right? Just get them on board. We know that there is one thing that helps people overcome this, and that's understanding science itself. So if we can get people to understand how science works, leave that seed there. Don't expect them to change their minds right away. That can help down the road. Another thing that you can do is, without using language that might trigger that backfire effect, talk about the impacts of climate change that they do care about. Instead of coming in and saying, you know what, climate change is real and you need to change your mind, maybe you can talk about what's going on with our agriculture and how people are having to change where and when they plant things, why floods and droughts are happening more and more in different places, the impact of greater storms, the changing climate patterns in the north, where we might have even more snow and colder winters under a climate change situation. So if we can get them thinking about things like food security and agriculture and problems that they might really care about, then we can probably start talking about understanding global warming, as you have the buy-in on the emotional side of the things that they actually do value. Affirm their identity, understand the person, and help them find others that they can identify with, right? So it's not just you, it's other people, but make sure that you're trying to appeal to people that they can identify with. And then we have this perceived consensus. Now, this is a big deal right here. All right. The thing is that science is actually very clear, and the scientific community doesn't hold climate change to be in any way in doubt or dubious. It is pretty solid acceptance among the scientific community. But the public doesn't know that. The public, 55% is what they think in terms of climate scientists agreeing on global warming. That's what the public thinks. Maybe 50-50, half and half. In reality, 97% or more of climate scientists agree on global warming. So why is there that difference? Why is there that disparity between the scientific community and the public? Probably because that's the way it's presented on TV and in the news. If you ever see anybody talking about climate change on the news, it's probably the guy on the right, Bill Nye, science guy. And he's probably sharing equal space on the screen with a climate denier. And it's not just Tucker Carlson. They'll bring in politicians, they'll bring in people who publish propaganda against climate change. They'll bring in all kinds of folks who are denying climate change to square off against the science guy. So the idea is, at least it's a 50-50 split, because that's how the screen looks, right? And you might even start thinking that Bill Nye is the only person who thinks about climate at all. This is probably why when John Oliver had Bill Nye on his show to debate a climate science denier, he wanted to make it statistically representative, and in fact brought in 97 climate scientists to counter the 3 deniers. It was a great big mess, but it illustrated the point that this is how it should be portrayed in the media, not as a dichotomy, as 50-50 split, but as an overwhelming acceptance of climate change among the scientific community. But how do we know that there is this consensus? Well, we can study this. We can study what climate scientists think and what climate science tells us. And we can do what's called meta-analyses, where we take all of the results of different papers and analyze them all together. Different reports from different scientists around the world over a period of time, and see if collectively the data that comes from them support the overall idea. We could do surveys of climate scientists, and many people have. And we could do a mathematical analysis of citation patterns. What kinds of papers are relied upon by scientists when they are informing their own science? So if we do that, and this one is from a good meta-analysis that looked at about 15,000 papers, 15,000 studies. And what they found is, if of those that took a position on anthropogenic global warming, global warming is happening and people are causing it, 97% of those studies endorse anthropogenic global warming. Or we could look at what the scientific organizations themselves say. like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has consistently concluded that this is a real thing. American Association for the Advancement of Science, global climate change is occurring now, and it's a growing threat to society. American Chemical Society, climate change is real, largely attributable to emissions from human activities and potentially a very serious problem. American Geophysical Union, human-induced climate change requires urgent action. Humanity is the major influence on the global climate change observed over the past 50 years. American Medical Association, this is real. American Meteorological Association, this is real and dangerous, and we're causing it. The scientific community is in no way in doubt about this science, but people don't know that. Only 1 in 7 Americans understand that almost all climate scientists, or more than 90%, have concluded that human-caused global warming is happening. Only 1 in 7 Americans know that. Most Americans think that global warming is a relatively distant threat. It's not affecting us yet, and probably won't for a while. But that's not what the scientific community thinks. And fewer than half of Americans hear about global warming in the media or from people they know at least once a month. That climate change denial machine is working very well. It keeps people in their bubble from hearing about this from people who are members of their communities. If they ever do hear about it, it's dichotomous. The people who don't know a whole lot about climate change, or the people who deny climate change, are probably getting their information from one or a few sources that are part of that climate change denial machine. And they only ever hear Bill Nye talking about it to the contrary, with a whole host of other people who share the screen 50-50 arguing him about it. So that's why we need you. We need people who are members of communities who have much more connection to the people at home, who might not necessarily hear about this in the media or from others that they know. We need you to be informed, to learn about climate scientists, climate science, and how to talk to people who might not ever hear about this stuff and might have identities that run counter to the science, and who might, you might trigger the backfire effect if you talk to these folks about this without really thinking about how you do it. So we need you to learn about how the science works, the information about climate science, and think very carefully about how that you will talk to people about it. And then we need you to do it. We need you to talk to people about climate science, climate change, that it's real, that it's a threat. And that's the only way we're going to break this climate change denial machine. So we're going to have some time to talk. We're going to have some questions.